com a primeira conferência da manhã, que será proferida pela professora Mauren O'Hara, que vem dos Estados Unidos, Califórnia. Eu vou falar um pouco sobre a Mauren e depois vou falar em inglês, porque nós temos aqui uma plateia mista, e aí facilita também para quem não entende português. A Mauren O'Hara é inglesa, radicou-se nos Estados Unidos há mais de 40 anos. Atualmente é professora da National University, que fica em La Jolla, na Califórnia, mas a trajetória bem-sucedida e bastante conhecida dela começa com o fato de que ela é bióloga e psicóloga. E ela fez o PhD dela tendo como orientador o psicólogo norte-americano Carl Ransom Rogers, que é o responsável, um dos responsáveis, com Maslow, com outros expoentes da psicologia nos Estados Unidos, da década de 40, 50, do século passado, pela criação e desenvolvimento da psicologia humanista. Psicologia humanista que nasce em solo norte-americano, com contribuições que vieram de europeus e norte-americanos, né? Muitos professores europeus que haviam imigrado para os Estados Unidos. E o Rogers é também o primeiro presidente da... Is it the first president of the APA?
No. Early president.
Okay. É um dos primeiros presidentes da APA, Associação Americana de Psicologia, e aí ele desenvolve a abordagem centrada na pessoa, Person-Centered Approach, que é muito conhecida, desenvolvida, e Mauren O'Hara vem se juntar ao grupo um pouco mais tarde, né? Ela é bem mais nova que o Rogers, e ela faz o PhD dela tendo o Rogers como supervisor. Ela vai participar ativamente da fase dos trabalhos do Rogers e da equipe com grupos, encontros de comunidade, que foi um movimento que evoluiu dos grupos de encontro da década de 70, com a ideia de um processo de vivência intensiva de pessoas das mais diversas profissões e com idades diferentes, sexos diferentes e vindas de locais diferentes, fora e dentro dos Estados Unidos, para viverem uma experiência de transformação em termos de recomeçar uma comunidade, né? Então, nessa fase, o Rogers não estava mais tão ligado à psicoterapia, mas estava trabalhando como cientista social, extremamente preocupado com os problemas que estavam eclodindo naquele momento nos Estados Unidos e na Europa, principalmente os problemas raciais, né, brancos e negros no sul dos Estados Unidos, e problemas religiosos e políticos, como o que estava acontecendo na Irlanda do Norte entre católicos e protestantes. E então, essa equipe do Rogers, e nessa fase Mauren já está com ele, vão desenvolver experiências em que o objetivo é facilitar um processo de convivência entre as pessoas, de maneira que elas pudessem aprender sobre tolerância, sobre aceitar diferenças sem valorizar moralmente a diferença. E isso, quando nós pensamos no que nós estamos vivendo hoje, torna-se bastante atual e necessário novamente, né? Parecia que isso era um fenômeno do meio do século XX, e se torna hoje uma coisa bastante presente para todos nós e urgente para a humanidade como um todo. Atualmente, então, eu vou falar um pouco dos prêmios, que a Mauren é uma pessoa bastante conhecida e respeitada, tanto nos Estados Unidos como na Europa. Ela recebeu diversos prêmios. O mais recente é Distinguished Lifetime Achievement, da American Psychological Association. Ela foi presidente da APA e ela foi presidente da Divisão 32 da APA, que é a divisão de Psicologia Humanista. é presidente emérita do Saybrook Institute. O Saybrook Institute é um instituto de pós-graduação que trabalha, basicamente, à distância. Está localizado, a sede em São Francisco, na Califórnia, mas eles têm um programa muito interessante de professores em diversos países, Itália, outros países da Europa e Estados Unidos, e os doutorandos, principalmente para doutorandos, residem nos seus próprios locais onde trabalham e desenvolvem o seu doutorado à distância e têm 2 encontros anuais. Então, é uma proposta inovadora em formação de pós-graduação, e Mauren foi presidente e, atualmente, presidente emérita do Saybrook Institute. E trabalhando agora numa universidade relativamente nova, que a característica é pessoas que retornam para completar seus estudos universitários, já adultos, e Mauren foi convidada para o desafio de trabalhar com pesquisa para esse tipo de alunos. Então, é também uma experiência bastante interessante. Nós estamos aqui trabalhando para um convênio entre a PUC e a National University. Mauren já veio 2 vezes à PUC, a convite da Pró-Reitoria de Extensão e Assuntos Comunitários. Eu sou atualmente a pró-reitora dessa área, porque ela tem um trabalho muito importante e que a motiva muito, que é o Futures Forum, que é um grupo de trabalho que começa na Escócia, e eles estão desenvolvendo projetos sociais a partir de ir contribuindo pela... Eles têm, como associados do Futures Forum, ou parceiros, pessoas assim, CEOs de empresa, o diretor da Ópera de Londres, professores universitários, pessoas que desenvolveram projetos sociais inovadores. E a ideia é encontrar soluções a partir dessas parcerias, e não investimentos em dinheiro, para ajudar a solucionar problemas, principalmente de populações vulneráveis nos mais diversos lugares do mundo. Então, a ideia que nos parece bastante interessante não é solucionar trazendo recursos financeiros, mas trazendo, vamos dizer assim, capacidades e desenvolvendo soluções junto com o saber local daqueles grupos que estão necessitando de uma solução para os seus problemas sociais mais urgentes. E sem desconsiderar, como nós também falamos aqui nos nossos projetos de extensão, o saber local, né? Não nós, como especialistas, chegando até as populações vulneráveis, mas fazendo uma parceria com elas em relação a isso. Bom, esse é um briefing aqui para ajudar a entender quem é a Mauren e qual vai ser a apresentação dela. Eu fiz o seguinte: Mauren tem um inglês muito fácil, e ela entende bastante português. Então, nós já fizemos a experiência de trazê-la, os alunos de graduação e de pós-graduação entenderam e, inclusive, interagiram com ela no final da conferência. Então, acho que não vai ser problemático, porque ela, inclusive, vai falar espaçadamente, e se vocês tiverem dúvida, durante a apresentação, vocês podem levantar a mão e ela explica, porque o que nós fizemos foi o seguinte: para não atrapalhar os slides que ela preparou, colocando coisas em português, eu vou apresentar um conjunto de slides bem pequeno, em português, agora no começo, para vocês darem uma lida e entenderem do que se trata. E depois ela vai, com os slides dela, falar em inglês e pausadamente dessa forma. Pode ser? Combinado? Vamos tentar essa experiência? So, in English now.
No?
No?
Don't do it in English. Let's just, 'cause we're running out of
Ok.
time.
Ela não quer que fale em inglês, porque ela diz que o tempo já está... Solange, podemos avançar um pouco no tempo? Cadê a Solange? Solange. You have time, dear, from 9:25, okay? Don't worry. So, go?
No, it's not necessary. I think what you said in English was enough.
Ok.
And they can look at my
Ok,
notes.
ela acha que é o suficiente porque eu falei os prêmios em inglês, e daí só para não atrasar mais, ok? Então, vamos passar os slides em português, que já estão lá. Fui eu? Ah. Ok, olha, tem um título e um subtítulo, porque quando tudo começou, o título que Mauren tinha nos enviado, que foi publicado na programação de vocês, era Você é uma pessoa do amanhã, que é uma frase tirada de um texto do Carl Rogers. Mas aí, o texto que ela trouxe é de difícil tradução, nós tentamos, que é Rising to the Occasion, e está traduzido como Superando os Desafios do Século XXI, que foi o que nós mais ou menos combinamos, que é o que ela entende como Rising to the Occasion. Ela fala dos problemas globais, pesquisadores conceituados, ela é bióloga e psicóloga, como eu falei, Carl Rogers, que é a influência principal. Então, deem uma lidinha aí. Ok? Posso ir? Ela vai falar principalmente das crises, que são consideradas como um conjunto de crises, e que, tradução ao pé da letra, a tempestade perfeita, the perfect storm. 3 níveis de crise que ocorrem simultaneamente nesse momento da história da humanidade, conceitual, cultural e existencial, minando a coerência nos níveis pessoal e social. As sociedades se desestabilizam, um contexto de dúvidas e incertezas gera reações que incluem atitudes defensivas, anarquia e também, no bom sentido, transformação. Aí ela vai falar sobre consciência e cultura. Para otimizar a possibilidade de transformação, é necessário um novo tipo de psicologia, que se adapte melhor às situações atuais. As pessoas do amanhã, termo cunhado pelo psicólogo humanista Carl Rogers, durante as turbulências dos anos 60 do século XX, possuem a consciência e a capacidade para lidar com essas crises de forma criativa e transformadora. E aí ela fala um pouco do Futures Forum, apoiando uma prática transformadora, que é uma entidade sem fins lucrativos que vem desenvolvendo não só a prática, mas hipóteses teóricas, diretrizes pedagógicas e práticas sociais que facilitam e impulsionam inovações transformadoras ao redor do mundo. Aí ela vai dar exemplos desses projetos e a necessidade do desenvolvimento de práticas consistentes com o paradigma dessa pessoa do amanhã. E aí, no final, ela vai falar sobre como superar o desafio e vai trazer algumas diretrizes práticas que eu achei que seriam muito longas para colocar aqui. É isso. Agora, com vocês, professora Mauren. Here, Mauren.
Is the sound? That's fine, isn't it? You can hear me? Excellent. Good morning. I'm glad to see everybody's awake. I'm not sure I'm awake yet, but we'll see. I'm going to try to give what I see as a bigger picture view of how we need to be creative and innovative in the current situation. Because I and many of my futurist companions believe that we're suffering not just crises of politics or economics or even ecology, but a crisis of civilization. And this is what most of my remarks will be addressing this morning. Now, a question. Can you understand my English if I speak at this speed? Is this okay? Excellent. I want to start out with something personal, and that is to tell you about 2 mentors of mine who I feel really blessed to have met in my career. Dr. Irene Manton. Wait a minute. I went too far. That's my problem always. I always go too far. So that should be... Oh, okay, yeah. So Professor Irene Manton, who was a fellow of the Royal Society, she was one of the few female scientists in Britain who was elected fellowship to the Royal Society at that time. And the other one is Dr. Carl Rogers, who was my psychology supervisor, as Vera explained. I began my career as a biological researcher, and Irene was the person who taught me how to be with my studies, with my subject matter, in a way that was invested and participatory in the research. She was a post-positivist scientist. She wasn't a participant in what yesterday we heard about the normal science. She very much was influenced by the new philosophy of science, in particular her best friend Michael Polanyi, who was a philosopher of science. And she believed that the ideal of objectivity was an illusion, and that all knowledge inevitably involves a subjective, aesthetic, and personal dimension. When I moved to the United States, I switched into psychology, and here I was fortunate again to meet up with Carl Rogers, and he agreed to be my supervisor. Like Manton, he was also very much influenced by the post-positivist views of Michael Polanyi and Abraham Maslow, and later on, David Bohm. And he too felt that the normal science was not a suitable approach for studying particularly human and social situations where the subject matter were other subjects. And so he felt that it was important for social scientists to develop a subject-to-subject orientation with regards to their research. Now, I dwell on what I learned from these early teachers, first because I want to acknowledge my indebtedness to them. I wouldn't be here today if it hadn't have been for what I learned from them. But also for teaching me to be creative, to live intellectually out of the box, to know the world not just as an observer, but as an engaged participant, and to reinforce the proposition that in unknown territory, in science that's really on the cutting edge, the stance of the humble learner is more fruitful than the stance of the expert. Now, let me see, that's right, okay. As probably all of you know, we are living in a time of deep uncertainty, of incoherence, of instability. And the conditions that are emerging today are unlike anything that humanity has experienced before. And as the 21st century proceeds, we're challenged to be creative and innovative on multiple levels. As cultures become disrupted, the modal psychology is disturbed, and as our psyches are disturbed, our cultures are further disturbed. So here we have cultures, our way of life creates the psychology that the people in that society have, the paradigms, the behavioral patterns, the emotional responses, and so on. And these, in turn, produce the culture, so that there's a coherent reciprocal relationship between the culture and psychology. But let me back off here. I've tried to simplify this, so just keep that in mind, that whenever cultures change, psychology changes. And whenever psychologies change, they create new cultures. Now, I want to propose that the most creative challenge that we have in this postmodern era is not necessarily creating new products, new ways of doing business, new vehicles for making electricity or new energy sources. But really, it's the creation of a new, more flexible culture which will support new paradigms, and it will support new kinds of action, new cultural arrangements, and an expanded consciousness. All of the trend lines, let me see, yeah, okay. All of the trend lines that we see around us are very pessimistic, that there are very few sources of hope in the world today. And I don't like saying this because it's kind of depressing, but if you look at the research on what's happening on planet Earth, it is really depressing. I'm going to need some water. Here, is some here? And these are just some of the sources of instability that we can look at today, all of which are affecting us psychologically. And let me say that this talk is going to be on my website. So you don't need to take notes. You don't need to follow all these details. They'll all be on the website, and you can look at them at your leisure. But just a quick glance, and you can see that almost everything that used to be stable, that used to be reliable, that used to be relatively slow-moving, is now rapidly changing. And that is going on all over the world. And that doesn't count for the wild cards, the things that we can't predict, like a president like Trump, or Brexit, or terrorism, or North Korea, or climate shift, or catastrophes like asteroids. All these are possible all the time, but these things we can actually see if we go and read the newspaper, watch the news, look online, and you will see evidence that all of these factors are beginning to come down and descend upon the psyches that we all have and the ways of life that we've all developed. And the situation is urgent, that the choices that we make in the next few decades, as persons, as institutions, and as a species, may determine the fate of all life on Earth. I think I've missed the Yeah. This is the challenge that Václav Havel gave to the US Congress in 1994, because he identified the problem that we're facing as a problem of consciousness. That he said, without a global revolution in the sphere of human consciousness, nothing will change for the better in the sphere of our being as humans, and the catastrophe towards which we are headed will be unavoidable. Think about what that means. So the structures through which we make sense, the paradigms, as we heard yesterday, through which we make sense of things, are under siege from many directions. And so we find ourselves attempting to make sense using conceptual frames, logic, values, constructions of reality that were developed for another era. And at the same time, the level of interconnectedness and complexity is rising exponentially and is now beyond anyone's capacity to understand or control. In a sense, we're all immigrants. We're all living in an unknown world. And I think I've already explained that. So that all of these forces are disrupting the cultures, and that has severe and acute psychological consequences. I've always liked this slide from The Guardian. I don't know whether you can read it, but it says up here, apocalypse now, and then down here it said, shouldn't there just be 4 horses of the apocalypse? Because all of these factors are with us all the time. Whenever we look at the news, go to see a movie, read a book, unless you read the escapist books that I read, that you will be inundated and barraged with news. Most of it is pretty depressing. And as we said in the slides at the beginning, in the International Futures Forum, which is one of the places that I work, we've sort of identified 3 different kinds of problems. And again, you can read these on the website so that we don't have to go into detail today. But essentially, the crises are conceptual. That's the frameworks and customary forms of action no longer are adequate to the current situation. They're cultural, that societies are divided and fractured, and they've lost their faith in established institutions, especially governance. And they're existential. Human activity now threatens the future of the planet. That there is now institutes at Oxford University and Cambridge University that are really studying the impact of human activity on the planet, which could potentially result in the death of mankind, and maybe even the death of the ecosystem, or if not the death, then at least the severe disruption and damage to this. In Zygmunt Bauman's language, we're living in an interregnum. And that is a time when the old rules have stopped being effective, but before new rules have arrived to guide action. So in the middle, between the old order and something new, there is this situation of liquid modernity, constantly changing circumstances, shifting priorities that make it difficult for individuals to have the time or the frames of reference to organize their lives under conditions of extreme ambiguity. Does this situation sound familiar to you? Do you know what this feels like? Okay. So this situation is generating acute anxiety, well, actually chronic and acute anxiety. This is my attempt to try to graphic this situation where the turbulence of the current situation, the dissolving rules, the complexity, all of the stuff I just mentioned in liquid modernity, creates this high anxiety. And there's 3 different kinds of responses that can be identified to this crisis. There's a control response, there's a collapse, or there's a transformation response. In the control response, which tends to be the most familiar to us, we take certain actions that are defensive. We try to put things back in the box. We try to simplify the world with certain conceptual strategies, cultural strategies, political strategies. And those strategies are all aimed at simplifying the situation so that anxiety is contained. So this response has a lot of conversations, them versus us, winners and losers, denial, we stay in the box, we signify things. Nothing, people will literally say, well, it's really not that bad. It's been this bad before. We've seen all this before, really. We'll get through this. Human beings always do. So that kind of denial is manifest as a way to control this level of anxiety. So is fragmentation, breaking things up into different kinds of groups. So if our groups are all different and identified, we don't have to deal with others. We don't have to deal with people who force us to think of the world in a different way and raise anxiety. Fundamentalism, different kinds of fundamentalism. There's religious fundamentalism, which we're all familiar with, but there's also a scientific fundamentalism, which Gregoire talked about yesterday, which when science insisted on their particular religious belief that only one kind of science actually leads to the truth. There's also emphasis on boundaries. We don't want any immigrants to come in. We don't want too much in the way of difference because it's too threatening. Alternatively, which is more dangerous, of course, is that you can give up trying to control things altogether, and that we get a situation where everything collapses, and this situation would be we would see nihilism, anarchy, violence, incoherence in general, and this kind of situation is highly unstable. And I used to think that the neurotic or control response was the most common, most familiar, the most likely. But in recent years, after seeing what's going on in many countries, including my own, I'm beginning to wonder if collapse is closer than we think. But a third possibility, and this is the one that I'm hoping we'll all get interested in, is to seize the opportunity that is presented by this dissolving of the old order and to try out transformative and even transgressive alternatives. Because it's often in times when the rules no longer work, when the center is dissolving, where the people on the margins, the people with the new creative ideas, the people who really can live outside the box, have the freedom to experiment and to try out new things and to challenge the status quo in creative ways. And we would consider this to be a transformative third option. Don't worry too much about these particular this is my guess about what some of these emergent innovations will be. But the important concept here is that there is an emergent transformative option, that no matter how bad things seem, there is always the opportunity to use the dissolving structure as an opportunity for creativity and for transformation. Now, briefly, I want to talk about personhood, because one of the things that happens in these large systems is that they develop a particular kind of personhood. And the persons that we've raised in Western cultures, and most of the cultural psychology puts Brazil not quite in the Western mode, but mostly, if you're educated in the university, even in Brazil, this would be the profile that our education and socialization system is aiming for. And again, we don't need to go into the details, but it will be on the website. But the important thing is it's rational, it's mechanistic, it's objective, likes clear boundaries, tends to be reductionist, individualistic, analytic. It has a distrust of the body and distrust of intuition and emotion, distrust of empathy, and is very competitive. That's the, if you like, the form of personhood that we would identify with the modern era. It's the modern psyche. But as you can see, all around us, including ourselves, this way of thinking, this way of being, this way of approaching the world isn't working very well with the level of complexity and the level of challenge that we currently face. But fortunately, no culture is always is entirely homogeneous. There are always deviants. And in a famous talk to graduating students in 1969, Carl Rogers referred to a new kind of person that he saw emerging in the turbulent culture of the 1960s. He called them persons of tomorrow. Rogers found that these new persons are more open to experience, they desire authenticity, they enjoy diversity, they live in the process, they value intimacy, distrust bureaucracy and big science, they're caring and empathic, are more connected to nature, more interested in the environment, less materialistic, and they were more spiritual. They're more interested in seeking spiritual fulfillment. And with amazing prescience, he wrote in 1969, the striking thing about these persons is that they are at home in a world with no solid base, a world of process and change in which the mind in its larger sense is both aware of and creates the new reality. They will, he said, be able to make the paradigm shift. So in 1969, Rogers was already identifying a cultural movement towards the creation of a new kind of personhood that was countercultural to the dominant culture of the early 1900s. So I began to be very interested towards my end of my relationship with Carl before he died. I began to be very interested in this possibility of a new form of personhood that would be more suitable for the 21st century that we were seeing around us. And in 2000, along with 30 other experts in multiple disciplines, I joined the International Futures Forum in St Andrews, University, Scotland. The project was to develop new theory and practice that could support a transformative response to the uncertainty of the times and to restore effectiveness in action. Now in its 17th year, the original project was for 2 years. It's now in its 17th year. We're slow learners, I guess. That our goal is to support people, these persons of tomorrow, people who are trying to do something different, who have the aspiration to do something different, but they're also frustrated that so little of what they try to do within the system actually results in getting them nearer their goal. So the group members were selected who had already decided in their own work that a new paradigm was needed and that the Enlightenment forms of action and thinking just were not adequate because they were developed during the Industrial Revolution. They were just not adequate to the kind of revolution that was going on in the 21st century. So we took a leaf out of Manton and Rogers' book and decided that if we really wanted to understand and have reasonable theory and reasonable conclusions about practice in today's complex situation, that we had to participate, we had to engage. We couldn't stand outside and consider these situations objectively. We had to engage and participate. And the phrase we used was that we were to act into new modes of thinking rather than think into new modes of action. So the action was put first, and the theory was hopefully to follow. And so to learn more about this phenomenon, where was there transformative action? Where was it happening? What was the profile of a transformative innovation, rather than as a innovation that simply moved the deck chairs around on the Titanic? That we started to look for people and look for projects that were not only changing how the game was played, like healthcare or education, but they were changing the game itself. That's what Gregoire said yesterday about you don't learn about electricity by studying candles. You have to consider how the game can be changed, not just the way the game is played. So we shadowed people who we thought were transformative people, transformative leaders. And some of them are people who you would know their names, not because they're CEOs of big companies, but because they're making a real difference. And one of them I can name was the director of the National Theatre in London. And I don't know whether any of you go to London, and if you do, go to the theatre. If you go to London, do go to the theatre. At that time, it was a kind of staid and kind of very good, but not particularly creative and not addressing the challenges of the times. And the person who took over became a model for how do you get a group of people, from people who clean the floors to stars that have international reputations, to collaborate together to create not just a play, but a whole cultural transformation through theater. And so what we learned from him and other people like him began to give us some sense of what it takes to be a transformative influence rather than just an innovator. And we also looked at organizations that were doing transformative things. Another one was an organization called the Watershed. It's an old warehouse on the docks in Bristol, in England, and it was decaying, was part of the urban problems. And a group of artists and writers and activists took over, got the council to give them the space, and they developed a center for artists and activists. But the goal for them was not to produce their own art as individuals. The goal was that this center would become a facilitator for a transformation of the whole city, so that they saw themselves as cultural leaders, not just as individuals who were doing creative things. Their vision was to create a new society. And we learned from them how they go about this level of work. These are just our people. We have artists, we have dancers, we have theoreticians, we have, I think that's me here. We have shamans, we have, this is Brian Goodwin, who created Schumacher College, and one of the people who founded Schumacher College in the UK. This is a person who is the futurist for the OECD in Europe. This guy is was the chief scientist for Hewlett-Packard. So we call them the wizards, although we didn't really do much magic. Most of the magic was done on us. And we've developed a praxis. Again, you can look at this on the website, but the important thing about it that we can mention here is that expertise is left in the background. We all had expertise, but that's not what we were there for. We were there to shadow, we were there to learn, we were there to listen, we were there to listen with subjective ears, and we were there to look for where the creative impulse might be. So the IFF praxis then tries to restore what modernity took out of the human story. It puts back interest in the body, interest in dance, interest in the physical reality, rather than only the abstract reality. And we began to trust that what we were seeing in all of these people and all of these projects was not just successful projects, or even in some cases, unsuccessful projects. What we were seeing was that in addition to their activism, their social projects that they were engaged in or whatever, something was going on with their consciousness. They were changing the kind of persons they were. Once they began to understand that if you try to affect a group of mothers who are concerned about their children, as we saw in India, where the mothers were trying to find out why the water in their village, was actually not a village, it was a slum, why the water was continued to be contaminated even though there was supposed to be funding to create a new source of water. Once the group began to understand from a bodily point of view what it's like to live in a situation where you don't know why your children are dying, that is a very different kind of challenge than if you look at it as a sociologist abstractly, looking at demographics and looking at child mortality and so on, that you begin to not only know about the situation, you begin to become part of the situation. And as you're part of the situation, you also can see how you might be able to help to be part of the solution. And what surprised us then, as we started to look at all of these successful innovations, and we found lots of them, was that it wasn't just the projects that were changing, but the people in the projects were changing. They were becoming a different kind of person. And in particular, they were reclaiming aspects of self that had been left behind by the Enlightenment, left behind by Western psychology, so the conceptual habits that the boxes that we talked about yesterday, the boxes of modernity, the normal science, the normal ways of looking at things, were suddenly exploded, and new forms of knowledge and new kinds of ideas, new capacities, new resources became available to be used that hadn't been being used before. Yeah, and the way I put it in the paper is that what we didn't see was people who had a specific set of skills, the kind of skill sets you learn in business school, or the kind of skill sets you learn in the books that talk about the habits of leaders. These people were whole persons. They weren't a collection of skills. They were people who reclaimed the resources of being a human being. And in particular, they became obvious to us that they were empowered and they were comfortable in what we would call the chaos, in the mess, in the complexity, in the situations that I was talking about earlier. They were comfortable in those situations. They didn't feel overwhelmed. Occasionally they did, but they were not afraid of them. They were comfortable in them. They embraced them. They actually saw creative opportunities within them. And they knew how to make other people comfortable and how to make other people feel empowered and effective in the same situations. And so so here's some examples of projects that we took a look at. Yeah, just before I go there. So we ended up feeling that there was real promise in what we were learning, that we were seeing people who initially had felt paralyzed by the size of the problems. They'd felt despair. They'd felt these situations were hopeless, that there was nothing that they could do because it was just too big. And we found them finding new resources within themselves and within their communities that allowed them to actually make a transformative difference. And so one example is this was from the city of Falkirk. And Falkirk was basically a company town for the oil company British Petroleum. And when we met the people in Falkirk, this is what Falkirk looked like. It was houses around the refinery, and their lives were completely involved in the refinery. But they had been told by British Petroleum that the refinery was going to be closed, and they were going to have 10 years to develop a new economy that wasn't dependent on oil. The people at first were absolutely devastated. Their entire community, their entire culture, back 4 generations in engineering and then the last 2 generations in oil, was suddenly gone. So they had come up with a 5-year plan, a strategic plan, and it had been facilitated by McKinsey, I believe, and it had all of the hallmarks of a McKinsey strategic plan. And they were fine with it, except they said, somehow it doesn't seem bold enough for us. It doesn't seem big enough for how we're feeling about the future of our children. It seems like more of the same, only a different industry or different ways of what was missing for them was imagination. What was missing for them was something that stirred their soul. And so they came to the IFF folks and said, maybe you could help us come up, do something that's more, that we would all feel better about. So the IFF group of 4 or 5 of us from IFF went to Falkirk. Falkirk is in Scotland, and it's between Edinburgh and Glasgow, and so in many ways it doesn't have anything, because Glasgow is Glasgow and Edinburgh is Edinburgh, and who's heard of Falkirk? Nobody. So they wanted something that would recognize that Falkirk is just as real and just as important as Glasgow. And so we went around the city. We looked at the plan. It wasn't a bad plan, and we didn't throw out everything, but we started to listen to everybody who had some kind of commitment to solving the problem and inventing a new future. And we listened to their hopes. We listened to their disappointments and their anger, their successes, their failures. We listened for theoretical frames that they were using. We listened for metaphors. We listened for emotions. We listened for visions. And we felt their sense of loss and despair with them. We sat there and realized what a loss this was going to be for everybody. We didn't pretend it wasn't going to be a loss. They didn't pretend it was not going to be a loss. They were all terrified, and we didn't know any more than they did about what the future held. So we partnered with them to be together as we started to listen for signs of the creative impulse that was there. And in all of the work that we do, no matter how bad it is when you start, it doesn't take long speaking to people to listen and hear a creative impulse that wants to get to work. And importantly, the new vision didn't come from us. It came from the citizens who were engaged with the reality of their own challenges. And eventually they came up with a new vision entirely, and the management were very excited. One of the strongest things that we noticed that everybody had ignored was that the Scottish people are very mythic people. They're people of myth and poetry. They're people of music, and they're people of their history. So we asked them for what would be a mythic figure that resonated with them about how Scottish or Falkirk's identity, a new identity, going from this identity to something new, what would it look like? And the children were the people who generated the image. They said, we want something mythic. They didn't use the word, but so we want big creatures. And they talked about these kelpies. This is a kind of a horse that lives in the sea. And the kelpies come up out of the water sometimes to help the people who are in trouble or who are in danger of sinking. So the Kelpies, and they're the surf, and they help people surf into the beach and be safe. And the children came up with this image, and they said, we want Kelpies. We need Kelpies. We need these horses that are going to hold us and take us into the shore so that we be safe. And these are the Kelpies. These are 30 meters high, and they are made by a local artist, and they got a grant from the British government for £25 million to build a whole eco-park that came out of the views of the citizens. They designed the park, they designed the priorities, they worked with the budget, they looked for the money, and they designed these Kelpies. Now, if you drive from Edinburgh to Glasgow, you have to go by the Kelpies. And when you go by the Kelpies, you go by the spirit of Falkirk. 10 years later, this is a different city. All of the goals for economic development, for ecological development, for educational achievement in the schools, for employment, all of the indicators of a successful city have all been surpassed substantially from what was present in the McKinsey strategic plan. And it continues. You go to Falkirk. We went back 10 years later, and they asked us, take a look at this and tell us, we think this place feels better, looks better, and works better. Are we right? Did that really happen? And the answer was yes. Everywhere we went, people felt better. We talked to people from the domestic spousal abuse, child abuse, alcoholism, nutrition. All of the indicators of well-being were all improved. And yet there'd never really been an objective plan to do this. All of these improvements had come out of the people talking to each other, talking to resources, and finding within themselves creative possibilities that they didn't know they had. This was not top-down. This was bottom-up and facilitated by the leadership that had access to resources. And these are the children. We asked them 10 years later, how do you feel about living in Falkirk? And this was their response. Great, they said. We're not leaving Falkirk. We're staying here. So I use this as an example because this is a situation where everybody in the city, to some degree or another, was invited to help recreate, to transform, to innovate, and to create a new social reality. And as we said, not only are all the external aspects of the culture different, the internal sense of self has changed. That not only is the external forming culture one that's hopeful and future-oriented and resource strength-based, the internal psychology of the people of Falkirk has changed. When we first went there, there was an epidemic of depression, there was an epidemic of alcoholism and poor nutrition and family violence. All of those figures, all of those statistics are improved, and the people feel more empowered. They feel more ready to get up and say, we can do that. Well, you think we could have gardens for growing vegetables? We can do that. The sense of a empowered community is pretty obvious now, in contrast to how it was in the beginning. They're also attracting creative industries that are coming to the city because the workforce is more creative than it used to be. It's about time. How much time do I have? I have what?
You can finish by 11:30 because we started 10:30.
Okay, so I've got plenty of time.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So, yeah, I got it. I have 15 minutes. That's good. So we now have a group of several of these projects that have the same kind of essence, where you begin with the psychology of we can't do this. This is the leaders should do this, or the government should do this, or the company should do this, or somebody else should do this. And you end up with a situation where you find that the greatest resource that any situation has is actually the people who have the problem. That instead of bringing in experts from outside to intervene and give them ideas about how to solve problems, the solutions are present in the group. And the SHINE project is, I won't go into detail, but the SHINE project, oops, there we go. This is a project for elder care. The people in Scotland were, the old people were very depressed, and many of them were ending up in the hospital because they wanted someone to take care of them. They were lonely, and they found that if they got something wrong with them, they could go to the hospital and that would care for them. And this was particularly true over the holidays, Christmas, and so on. So they found that the principal reason why people go to the hospital in Scotland, older people go to the hospital in Scotland, is because they're lonely, not because they're sick. So the SHINE project links up old people who are not sick with old people who are sick or need some help. And they work together to create friendships. So the SHINE project is using the resource of human friendship to help deal with a healthcare issue in the community. Healthcare costs have gone down dramatically, and the amount of money that is needed to run this project is not from large amounts of government money. This is the creative efforts of the local people. And they, and each time a group of people are successful, more people want to do it. So it grows. It becomes its own generative process. Again, it's not driven by the authorities, it's driven by the people who actually have the problem. The Galgale project is a project for young teenagers who were drug addicts and small violence. And the local carpenters who had been themselves lost work, they were unemployed, decided to teach these young boys how to make boats the way that their ancestors 900 years ago used to make boats. So they get the kids together and they start with the wood and go from the wood all the way to the boat which they take out on the ocean. This whole process is done just by the teenagers, and the only rule that they have is you can't be high on drugs while you're here. You can be high on drugs when you're not here, but when you're here, you have to be sober. They have a 95% success rate for these children with no professional intervention at all. The intervention is simply men from the community who themselves were out of work and depressed, who are now helping the teenagers to do something that is linked to their ancestry 900 years ago when the Vikings went to Scotland. This is a project in India. This is another project that has to do with environment, where we take simulations to schools, young kids learning about their environment. The Nuka model of care is an interesting case too. The Nuka model was developed in Alaska by the native Alaskans, and it was geared towards helping they had a big epidemic of child abuse, particularly child sexual abuse, in the villages in Alaska, the native villages. And the local people created a new healing process for these men, mostly men, who would abuse their children. And the process links to their old culture, links to their old mythology, links to their old concepts of manhood, their whole concepts of family and stewardship, all the things that were indigenous to the native culture. And they bring these offenders, who themselves are victims, together to work on transformation of their lives from lives of being displaced from their world to a life where they can re-own their culture. And what happens is remarkable, that the people heal and they are able to teach other people to heal. A group in Scotland brought the Alaskan natives to Glasgow, which was one of the poorest cities in Europe and had the worst health statistics in Europe, brought them to Glasgow, and they've now created a Nuka project in Glasgow where they use the local mythology, they use the local traditions, the local music, local ways of getting together to work with child abuse and domestic violence. Again, this is not funded by the expensive healthcare systems, because these systems they're disintegrating. There will be no money for these kinds of programs in the future. The National Health Service in Britain is disintegrating. So these projects use the creative impulse, use the creative, innovative capacity that's always there. It's always there in any community, but it's usually stifled by all these different mechanisms that create the box that we were talking about yesterday. And once that box begins to soften and disintegrate, which is what's happening now in the 21st century, the creative impulse can emerge and does emerge. And if it's supported by people who who see what's going on and recognize what's going on, then it grows and it magnifies. And we have lots of examples of how this is happening in Scotland as part of the IFF work. But then I would have to say is that IFF is not the only source of this kind of work. Paul Hawken, who is a California pioneer, identified over 1 million non-profit organizations, charitable organizations all over the world who are involved in projects like this, that are involved in projects that use the resources of the local people to transform the conditions of their life. And I did a study of the mission statements of those organizations that were dedicated to some aspect of consciousness, whether it was education or just social justice or eco-awareness. There was about 35,000 of them. And I looked for the keywords that were present in their mission statements. And these were the keywords that I found. These were the words that showed up the most often. And I'll just give you a second to read them. Yeah, I can. Yeah. So what I would say is that what we're seeing here is a cultural innovation, is a cultural movement that is going on off stage. It's not going on in the universities. It's not going on in the official government projects. It's going on with millions of individuals and groups who have decided that the big system really is collapsing, really can't deliver a new way of life, can probably not deliver saving the environment, taking care of people who need care, who need services, can't do it. These systems are done. They were built in the 19th century. They're built on bureaucratic structures, and they're built with a psychology that is unsuitable for the complexity of the problems that we're now having to deal with. And these small groups of people, first of all, are solving the problems that they have, but in the process of doing so, they're becoming a different kind of person. They're learning to deal with gender issues. They're learning to deal with there they are. They're learning awareness and to participate and empathy. All of these characteristics don't show up very much on what I would call the modern person. These are aspects of the modern capacities are still going to be needed. We're still going to need good science. We're still going to need all of the objectivity and the values of that kind of system. But it has to be augmented now with these other dimensions of consciousness which we've devalued in the 19th and 20th century and now have to be revalued. They have to be re-embraced and made central to how we raise our children, how we organize our projects, and how we organize our learning. So I think what I have is if you go to the website, you'll find many of these projects, and in particular, we'll find a couple of places where if you want to do a project, if you have some idea that you want to try out, some project that you think is waiting for your input, you'll find some help on how to set it up. And if you need our help, you just have to contact us. We will help you help yourself, help the people that you're interested in. Because we're in this together. This planetary challenge, this threatening existential, cultural, and conceptual crisis of the 21st century, nobody is immune from this. We're all going to have to participate. And so IFF makes itself available to help anybody that has an idea that you want to get started on. So I will stop there, and if there are time for a few questions, that would be fine. Okay? Mm-hmm.